what the thing that we're shooting for, or have been attempting to do, was to release 2 albums in 1 year. Kind of like the old timers used to do.
Which old timers are you thinking of?
Frank Sinatra.
Mm.
Like, he used to put out a couple albums a year.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you say old timers, you're talking like 40s, 50s. We're going back here.
Yeah, just cranking them out. And so that's what we were shooting for. But it looks like we're going to have to delay the release of this album by a couple months. So I don't even know. I don't know if that's official. This was a conversation that I had with Ken from the label even last night, because he got word from the record pressing plant that they're not going to have the vinyl until late March. So the release date for the album was like mid-December. And we were thinking, if the vinyl is a little bit late, that's okay. If you have to wait a month for it, people can kind of just pre-order the vinyl or whatever. But it's looking more like people would have to wait like 4 months for the vinyl. So we're talking about just postponing the release of the actual album.
You feel obligated to push everything back because of the vinyl?
This is something that we're trying to figure out. I mean, Ken was saying, he's never been in this situation before where there've been these kind of delays in vinyl production. And so do you just kind of move forward, release it digitally, release it on CD, and then consider that an album release, and when the vinyl happens, it happens? Or do you kind of wait and do it all at once? Because, if we release the album in December, then the vinyl isn't really going to be part of the kind of promo push that we're doing. It'll be like a separate entity, and people might not really know that the vinyl is there. But the thing is, at this point, our press agent has already started the promo cycle for the album. So, here I am doing interviews for an album that's supposed to come out in December. And you're really the first interview that I've done in the cycle so far. So I don't know if in the next couple of days, even this is going to change. If we are, officially pushing the release date back, if the other interviews are going to be rescheduled or what. So it's a little confusing right now. It's a strange situation that I'm sure a lot of bands are in, because the vinyl delays are like ridiculous. And
I don't know if this is sort of too nuts and bolts for people. I find it super interesting because I would assume that, press pushes were already changing before the pandemic. And now that, bands just aren't really on tour anymore, obviously everybody's had to kind of rethink that cycle regardless. I wonder, ultimately, I guess how much of the interacting that people do with the album is through vinyl. I mean, it's probably still a majority streaming for you at this point.
There's a lot of streaming, and actually CD sales are surprisingly strong. Like, I think for the last album, Hideout Sessions, we sold more CDs than we did vinyl. So people are still buying them. Although, that I found that surprising, because I don't own a CD player anymore. I do it all vinyl or streaming.
Is that an anomaly? I mean, you do sound a bit surprised by that stat.
Yes. Like when we released Destination Failure, like it never came out on vinyl. We asked the label to do vinyl for one of the singles we did. There's a 10-inch vinyl single of I Know You Love, but the album itself only came out on CD. I know that Born to Quit came out on cassette, but back then, yeah, everybody was doing CDs. And then I think eventually, not only did vinyl kind of come back, but also people became a little disillusioned with CDs, because like they're not quite as permanent as you would hope. I mean, the as a format, they kind of degrade more than we originally thought that they did. And also, just there's a kind of sterility to the sound of it compared to vinyl. But I'm saying this as a vinyl lover. Obviously, I have my preferences, and that is to hear the warmth and the all the cracks and pops of listening to a record.
I suspect that you probably wouldn't be super dissimilar from one of your average fans, though. I assume that people who follow your career and follow the Smoking Pope's career are people who are pretty deeply into music. I mean, it's not something that you kind of casually interact with these days, right? It's something that you, to a certain extent, do have to seek out.
Yes, you do. I don't know, man. I mean, like if we're, I don't, when Ken and I were talking about whether to push the release date back, I don't think we landed on anything specific. I think we were leaning towards doing that, but like he was telling me, he's like, we've never been in this situation before. And it's not just, I mean, it's a unique time for a lot of reasons. One of those being the sort of bizarre factors that contribute to the delay in vinyl production, things having to do with the supply chain and like the way that the pandemic played into it, so that everything was shut down and now it's roaring back, and major labels, taking up a lot of the pressing plants everywhere with their, albums that they're going to be selling at Target and stuff. So there's that. But then there's also these questions about, just like you're asking, like how important is vinyl, since we have a variety of formats that people are listening to music. Like to me, it seems like, man, if we don't have the vinyl, we can't do this. But like maybe to the average person, that's a much smaller deal. Well, you don't have vinyl yet? Okay, I'll get it on CD, or I'll just pay for the download. I don't know. It's hard to know how to gauge it.
What was the initial impulse to do 2 albums? I mean, as you were alluding to before, like you said, in the old days, was it really just to kind of have a project to work on during all of this?
Well, I think the kind of push, the impulse to do a second album right away had to do with the theme of the Hideout Sessions album being something that was done under a specific set of circumstances, where it was recorded at an empty club. And so it's basically a live performance that was done as a virtual concert. So it's like kind of a halfway live album. But once we did one of those, I was aware that once things opened up again, that would shift. Like there was almost like the fact that clubs were shut down for the pandemic. It was a unique window of time where this kind of a project would make sense. It's almost like I wanted to hurry up and get in another one of these kind of albums before we got back to normal shows with people in them. Like I suppose I could still do these at an empty club and record stuff there, but like I wanted it to be performances that were authentically born out of the necessity of having to do virtual shows because you couldn't have people gather. And also, this was made possible by the fact that I wasn't writing a bunch of new material for these albums. We were just arranging songs, like a lot of older songs, and also kind of reworking songs that I had already written. And when we first did the first one, the Hideout Sessions one, there was something like 40 some days between the time that we did our first rehearsal and the time where we played the show that actually got captured for the performance. So that's such an incredibly short period of time. And if I was writing an album, it would take months to develop the material. And here we were able to develop an album's worth of material in like a month and a half. And I just realized that is probably why Frank Sinatra could put out multiple albums in 1 year, because he wasn't writing all the songs. If you have the material there, you just have to get together with your band and work out an arrangement for existing material, which is it's an artistically satisfying thing to do, but it's also just much quicker than the writing process. So I thought, we could do the Hideout Sessions was recorded in October of 2020. And then the Space Sessions was recorded in was it May or was it March? It was March. It was one of the M months. It was like March. So it's only like a few months later, really.
For yourself and for the fans, you get this document of the time, right? You get this work of art that was like not only very much born out of the circumstances around it, but in some sense a reflection of those circumstances.
That's true. Yeah. So I mean, I'm happy that things are opening up again and that we get to play real shows in front of live audiences. That, to come back to that after so long was such a life-giving thing. The first show back that we played in front of an actual audience, I almost lost it. I seriously, for the whole first half of the show, I was like choking back tears. I was so overwhelmed at the experience, and I didn't realize how much I had missed it, or that I had sort of needed to be playing in front of audiences. And so that's great. I'm happy that that's happening, but I also am glad that we were able to document with two full-length albums this kind of unique period of restriction where you could only play virtual shows.
It's interesting to hear you describe it that way. I had listened to a recent interview that you did, and you talked about playing together with the band after, I guess an extended hiatus. And you described it similarly. You didn't know quite how much you missed it until you were really on stage playing those songs again with those people again. Is it just sort of the realities of of daily life, or our ability to compartmentalize? Was it not something that really occupied your thoughts much in the interim?
I think it was just, the interim was filled with kind of dealing with the situation that was in front of you and sort of playing the hand you were dealt. And we were all just kind of trying to get through. I didn't have a lot of bandwidth for specifically thinking about sort of the role that live musical performance played in my life. But there was obviously something, to come back. I remember that first show that it was hitting me on a couple levels. One was that there was something powerful collectively going on in the room about the fact that all of us on stage and in the audience had all been being deprived of this kind of communal exchange of energy that has been meaningful to us. And it was sort of a reminder that, perhaps we had been taking that for granted before, but now this is something that we are cherishing. But then from my specific vantage point, it sort of was striking to me that being in the position of performing music in front of an audience is apparently some essential part of my makeup as a person, where if that's not happening, I feel somehow incomplete, which is something that almost was unsettling to me, because you don't like to think that you're particularly dependent on anything.
It's really easy to take things for granted, particularly when you've been doing this for as long as you have. I mean, you've been playing in rock bands for a long time. You started when you were fairly young. How many people do you know in your life outside of people who play in bands who have been doing something since they were a teenager or in their early 20s? It becomes easy to lose sight of that when you've been doing it for so long, and when it's your daily reality, and when, honestly, probably more days than not, it's kind of a pain in the ass.
It can be, but it's more than worth it to be able to have the kind of transcendent experience of participating in a performance. Even the performances that aren't as great as other performances they still have a transcendent quality to them. But I think that's kind of, for me, that's because playing music in front of people is one of the only times where I'm fully present in the moment. I'm almost, and I assume that this must be universal for a lot of people, most activities in your life, your mind isn't fully engaged 100% in the activity that you're doing at the time. You're kind of like always able to kind of think about something else at the same time. But playing a show is something where the whole time that it's happening, there's something so kind of urgent about that situation that I'm just there. And the entire energy of my being focused on the task at hand and engaged in it. And there's such a kind of purity of purpose and focus to that it's kind of addicting. And I suppose like different people can have that in different arenas of life. But for me, it's musical performance.
Can also be easy to lose sight of that fact too when you're kind of caught up in all the trappings. You know, I know obviously you've been playing music for some time, but it sounds like once the bands really hit, things moved really quickly, and you almost got. I mean, you know, you were there at this in the heady days of the 90s. You know, this kind of this last throw for a lot of these major labels.
Yeah.
It's probably pretty easy to get swept up in that and lose sight of why you were doing what you were doing in the first place.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I think from what I've observed, that is difficult for a lot of people to deal with. There's been this kind of adjustment period of, okay, we were in bands, and then this thing happened where like major label interest kind of just like swept through like a tidal wave through, you know, punk music and alternative music back when we were calling it alternative. But like, you know, then those of us who are really more at home at the indie level, that's really the kind of bands that we are. We were thrust into this major label world with a taste of commercial success that, for a lot of people, was unique to that time. And so when the wave of, when you're sort of on the other side of that wave, you know, then you have to go about the business of like coming back to your center of who you are and the reasons why you're doing what you're doing, separate from the weird flurry of insanity that was the 90s.
What did that sort of revelation look like for you? What was that process like? And at least from the outside looking in, it looks like you know, while the band took a break, you never really took, at least not too extended a break from making music. Like
you mean in the period between like 99 and 2005?
What was the process of recalibrating? Like, you know, when you've had that high and for better or for worse, you've kind of come down from it.
Like, I guess I would have to start by pointing out that the high that we're talking about that happened in the 90s was not something that I dealt with particularly well. And it resulted in like sort of a personal downward spiral that I experienced with substance abuse and just kind of a personal darkness for me that resulted in like a spiritual upheaval that happened for me in the late 90s. You know, when I became a person of faith and a follower of Jesus, and that sort of set me on a path that I'd never been on before. But it provided a necessary anchor for me. But part of that whole journey was taking a few years off of being in any band. And then when I came back, I wasn't quite ready to come back to the Smoking Popes. So I did this other band called Duval for a few years, which was kind of like it was like a version of the Smoking Popes where I was able to write more specifically about issues of faith that I was dealing with. So then by the time the Smoking Popes actually got back together, it was like 7 years after we had broken up. And although there was enthusiasm about our reunion at the at sort of the grassroots level of our fans, like people were coming to the shows and there was a lot of excitement there. But we found coming back that the music industry had changed, and we kind of, we're looking for a label. We discovered that we definitely, couldn't go back to a major label because this kind of separation had started to happen already, where like the major labels were only working with sort of like bigger, like 1% kind of artists, whereas like in the 90s the major labels were just throwing money at anybody who sort of upon which they could tack the name alternative. But like that was not the case anymore in 2005. It had started to change, I think largely because of the internet and streaming services were starting to emerge. And so labels weren't able to sell quite as many units as they used to. And so they just, they weren't as flush as they used to be. So, it was a bit of a process for us to like look for a label that was going to work for us. And we wound up going back to Asian Man Records, just because Mike Park is a wonderful guy who is just lovely to work with and trustworthy and supportive and all that kind of stuff. It was just a different world. And it obviously wasn't going to be, it was like we were going to be operating in a different sphere than we were in the 90s. But it was like another situation, almost like a self-imposed pandemic lockdown, where we had been doing something for a while and then stopped doing it for a period of time. And then coming back to it, there was a fresh sense of appreciation for like, we love to do this, like for its own sake. Yeah, I remember coming back and like we started to play shows, and I enjoyed performing live after we got back together more than I ever had in the 90s.
I know it's probably not a particularly useful exercise to relitigate some of this stuff, but I'm kind of going to ask you to a little bit from the standpoint of having that level of success that quickly, that early on. At the end of the day, do you think it was a blessing or a curse for yourself and the band?
I don't know. That's so speculative, because I know, being a person of faith, I believe that the things that have happened to me have been allowed to happen to me for a reason, So even if I look at things and I see that they were difficult, I believe that those difficulties and struggles are something that God uses to help make us stronger and to build us up and to teach us things. So
it's exactly what put you on the path that you're on now.
But now I think mostly I look back on that, and the thing that still remains from that era is the music that we made. So I look back on, the real album that we made while we were on Capitol. I mean, that we had already made Born to Quit, and that got picked up by Capitol. But then while we were signed to Capitol, we made this album called Destination Failure. I am proud of that record. And I'm proud of the fact that even though we were swept up in the weird pressures of now being involved in a corporate music situation, that we, mostly through just being weirdly stubborn, were able to resist a lot of the influences of the label and the A&R guys. And I look back on that and I see that album it doesn't have like corporate fingerprints all over it. It feels to me like a genuine artistic statement. And I think that's why people still like that album, whereas like, I think there was the potential there that we could have made something that was more slick and more contrived. And we would look back on it and see it as nothing but an attempt to appeal to the masses. And even if that had worked and we had, even more commercial success with that album, we wouldn't be as proud of it.
How did you avoid record label interference at that point? I mean, I would assume that, when you're on a label like that, they want to have their fingerprints all over the thing.
If you recall, in the 90s, a lot of people were making a big deal out of the idea of selling out. So, do you remember all the crap that Jawbreaker got for signing to a major?
Green Day got it.
All these bands got it because that was the initial kind of transition that punk was moving from underground to mainstream. And so there was a lot of people who felt like punk was it had like a lot of ideological underpinnings that were being corrupted by the whole major label thing. And I think it was mostly paranoia about that made us resist most of the promotional ideas that the label wanted us to do. And made us have a kind of antagonistic relationship with like label representatives that were trying to speak into the making of the album. Because we had signed the contract, but now we felt like we were sort of caught in this culture war between our actual fan base who were punks and then this world of like commercial success who were like, we knew there were a lot of potential record buyers, CD buyers out there, but that they perhaps weren't deeply rooted fans who were going to stick with us, because you don't when you're just buying things because that's what's getting played on the radio,
or because it's in a movie
or whatever. So we felt like we were kind of desperately trying to hold on to our independence and our identity as a punk band, while reaping the benefits of having signed a major label record contract and having all that distribution. And so the result really was that the label became so frustrated with us that they ended up, not wanting to work with us anymore. And that sort of ended our relationship with them. So I don't know, you could say that's a bad thing, but like, as I have pointed out, the upside of that is that we were able to make the album that we wanted to make with a major label budget. That's great.
If I understand the timeline correctly, you had also already underwent, or I guess started the process of undergoing your spiritual transformation on there. And that did manifest itself into at least one song on the record.
Yeah.
Probably not what necessarily Capitol was hoping for in a punk record at the time. That spiritual journey for me started while we were making that album. And that's what the song I Know You Love Me was about, because it was one of those things where we made the album and we got the classic We Don't Hear a Single. So we had to, a couple months later, had to go back in and record. I think I Know You Love Me is the only additional song that we recorded, but like during that intervening time is when, I started to have faith in Christ and started to write about that. And I don't know, I think the song, it just kind of came across as a love song. I had to have it explained to me what it was about, which I'm probably not unique in that respect. Yeah,
I wasn't quite to the point where I was going to mention Jesus by name in a song and try to put that on an album. That's what Duval was for after I got them going. But
you were intentionally making something that could be interpreted in a number of ways.
I ended up having to take some time off. I took a few years off from being in a band just to focus exclusively on becoming grounded in my faith. And I'm glad I did that, because I think I needed I needed that. Otherwise, I was kind of concerned that this kind of Christian thing that I was going through was just going to become a potential phase that I had gone through. It happened to me, and then I just immediately tried to incorporate it into what I was doing artistically. And like, if that didn't work, I would just sort of move on from it and go back to being the person that I was before. And I desperately didn't want that, because I definitely had come to a place where, the things that I needed to figure out about being a person and, addressing the kind of existential issues that had been plaguing me, those were of far greater importance than my musical career. So I needed to just dive into just for a few years, just go to church. And the only place that I was playing music was in church, and I didn't have any aspirations for a musical career outside of that. And that gave me a great sort of foundation to sort of become, as it were, a new person in Christ.
Was it difficult to reconcile these things? I know oftentimes, at least historically from the outside, I get the standpoint that sort of secular music and rock and roll in particular, and all the things that it represents can kind of be at odds with being a person of faith.
Yeah, but I never felt like the music itself that I was making was at odds with being a person of faith. I know that there are things about touring and, hanging out in clubs and things that are, that tend to have debauchery written all over it. So there's a lot of opportunity to live in a profoundly ungodly way when you're hanging out in rock clubs. So I just needed to sort of develop a firm sense of who I was now and what I was and was not going to be doing with myself, on a daily basis. And so, when I went through that period and came back to playing shows, I came with a confidence that I could go, into, bars and clubs and places that I used to hang out in, and I could go in there and I can not get ridiculously intoxicated and behave in ways that didn't honor God and weren't consistent with my faith, So I do think that those two things are separate. Rock music is not inherently evil. Although I did that the first church that I belonged to at that time, when I started playing rock music out again in the world, they were against it because they did feel that it was inherently a compromise for me to be doing that. And I disagreed with them. So I left that church and I found a different one. I wasn't particularly conflicted about it.